Let's talk about HR in a global environment. We are a very diverse and very global group, and so this will be a very interesting topic for us. So let me share my screen here and get this. Get this going. Okay, so managing global human resources. More managers today are managing people from all over the world. The purpose of this chapter then is to improve your effectiveness at applying the human resource knowledge that you've been gaining and the skills that you've been developing when global challenges are involved. The topics that we will discuss today then are HR challenges of international business, how inter-country differences affect HRM, methods for staffing global organizations, important issues in training, appraising, and compensating international employees, similarities and differences in employee engagement around the globe, and how to implement a global human resource management program. So let's begin with understanding the HR challenges of international business. So the manager's global challenge, you don't have to dig very far to see how important international business is to companies here and abroad. Going global requires addressing international human resource management issues. The challenging thing about managing globally is that what works in one country may not work in another country, and managing that can be challenging. The employer faces an array of political, social, legal, and cultural differences among countries and people abroad. So the employers rely on international human resource management to deal with global HR challenges. And so we are going to deal with concepts and techniques employers use to manage the human resource challenges of their international operations. And that is going to include acquiring, training, and appraising, compensating employees, and attending to their labor relations, health and safety, and fairness concerns around the globe. So we can define IHRM, International HRM, as the human resource management concepts and techniques employers use to manage the HR challenges of their international operations. Next, we're going to look at examples of how inter-country differences affect HRM. So as we said, the challenges of international HRM don't just stem from the distances involved, even though this is important. The bigger issue is dealing with the cultural, political, legal, and economic differences among countries and their people. The result is that what works in one country might fail in another. A company operating multiple units abroad does not have the luxury of dealing with a relatively limited set of economic, cultural, and legal variables. The point is that managers have to adapt their human resource policies and practices to the countries in which they are operating. And so this figure here sums up the critical inter-country differences. Countries differ widely in their cultures. In other words, in the basic values their citizens adhere to, and in how these values manifest themselves in the nation's art, social programs, the way they do things. Cultural differences manifest themselves in differences in how we do things and how we act. in how we expect others to act. Such differences can frustrate people. They can frustrate employers, and they can wreak havoc in a company, between the manager, between peers, and we need to be able to help the employers and the peers and the teams to understand each other more. Geert Hofstede developed a model to help us understand cultural differences. And so he studied 5 different values among societies. And so he calls them power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. And you see the link there to his website. And if you've taken my class in international business relations, we spend a lot of time on this. In fact, we spend the entire course researching this and learning about this. And the more you understand the framework, the structure of a culture, and you can compare that structure to another culture, the easier it will be to be able to understand the framework that someone is coming from and understand that person at an individual level, and be able to understand them and not judge them for how they're different. Rather, understand their differences, understand how you function, and then start a conversation from a different point of view, and help teams work together that way. So for example, power distance represents the degree to which less powerful people accept the unequal distribution of power in society. So he concluded that acceptance of such inequality was higher in some countries, such as Mexico, than is in others, such as Sweden. In turn, such differences manifest themselves in different behaviors. To see how one country compares to another, I could play around with that website. So, for example, in one country, an employer may be able to fire someone at will. In another country, you may have to get permission from the government to fire someone. So you need to really understand those things, okay? And so you need to understand the legal factors behind the cultures as well. Similarly, differences in economic systems translate into differences in inter-country HR practices. For example, dismissing an employee in China or in Europe is more difficult than in the US, and may be more costly in those countries. In market economies, such as in the US, governments play a relatively restrained role in deciding what will be produced and sold. In planned economies, the government decides and plans what is going to be produced and sold at what price. In mixed economies, such as China, many industries are still state-owned, and the government will have a lot to say in what is produced, and will have an influence on the pricing process. So the differences in economic systems will affect HR practices as well. So to appreciate the employment effect on culture, economy, and legal differences, you really need to look at the practices in a particular region. So for example, the European Union, there is a minimum European wage, there are working hours, there are termination of employment policies, and by coming together as the European Union, they were able to gain much bigger economies of scale. China, for example, employers relied on China's huge workforce to provide products and services at low cost. And part of the reason for the low labor cost was the dearth of labor laws on things like severance pay, minimum wage, and benefits. But things are changing. For one thing, China's workforce, while still huge, is growing less quickly. For another, China has a new labor contract law. This adds many new employment protections for employees and makes it more expensive for employers in China to implement personnel actions such as layoffs. So multinational companies doing business in China argue that the new laws will raise labor costs and make it more difficult to lay off employees. So the cost of labor is going to rise in China, right? Recruiting, for example, compared to some Western countries, it is relatively difficult to recruit, hire, and retain good employees. China's employment contract law requires, among other things, that employers report the name, sex identification number, and contract terms for all employees they hire within 30 days of hiring to local labor unions, local labor bureaus. So the regulations in China, for example, make it so that you need to understand Chinese laws, Chinese rules, to be able to do a good job over there. And you need to work with a local partner. It's not going to be advantageous for you to try to work alone over there. Now, let's look at staffing in global organizations. International staffing, or should you go home, work home or local? In general, we can classify an international company's employees as expatriates, home country nationals, locals, or third country nationals. Expatriates, or short expats, are non-citizens of the countries in which they are working. So expats may also be parent or home country nationals, citizens of the country in which the multinational company is headquartered. Locals are citizens of the countries in which the employees are working. And expats may also be third country nationals, citizens of the countries other than the parent or the host country. Whether to use expatriates, locals, or some other type of generally depends on quantifiable considerations such as cost. So it's not just hard facts that influence such decisions. It may be that it's the stage of the internationalization of that company. It may be the availability of the company. It may be the availability of the labor, or it may be how easy it is to gain visas for that area, okay? So an ethnocentrically oriented company, the company tends to staff its positions abroad with employees from its headquarters. The polycentric company staffs positions abroad with locals or host country employees. And the global company aims to attract the best candidates to wherever it's needed. So there is a free flowing of employees to whatever location is needed. So expats versus locals. Employers can't find a local candidate with the required qualifications, so they send someone from another location. And then there's the consideration of offshoring. So moving an operation, a business process to another location based on the availability of the workforce that they need. In most respects, screening managers for jobs abroad is similar to screening them for domestic jobs. Candidates need the technical knowledge and the skills to do the job, and the intelligence and people skills to be successful. However, testing is widely used. Traditionally, most selection of expatriates was done solely on the basis of successful records of job performance in the home country. The candidate's ability to adapt to a new culture is often secondary. However, international transference or transferring, moving to another country spells big failure. And so we test a lot. We try to do adaptability screenings and try to ensure that people are able to move and be successful in another culture. The cost of having to move someone home early is very expensive. And most of the time it's because the family was not able to adapt. And so we do realistic previews. We try to make sure that the family is adaptable as well. And they may even have families go and visit to try to ensure that families can handle the move as well. So let's look then at important issues to keep in mind in training, appraising, and compensating international employees. So when it comes to the orientation and training required for expatriate success abroad, the practices of many US employers reflects more talk than substance. Executives agree that international assignees do best when they receive this special training, things like language and culture that they require, but few companies provide it. Many vendors offer packages, pre-departure training. Some employers use returning managers to cultivate the global mindsets of those departing. There is ongoing training, so beyond such pre-departure training, more firms provide continuing in-country cross-cultural training during early stages of the overseas assignment. Employers also need to make sure their employees abroad are adhering to their firm's ethics codes. And so giving them training in that area is very, very important, because the pressure when you go overseas is going to be very different, and very ethical standards in different countries are going to be different, and America holds to their standard very, very firm. And so this creates a lot of tension. Several things complicate appraising an expatriate's performance. So you've got cultural differences, who does the appraisal, adapting the criteria to the local job, weighing the evaluation more towards the on-site manager's appraisal, and then using a former expatriate from the same overseas location for advice is very, very good, because the job may be very different, and to appraise them based on US standards may not be appropriate. How do you compensate managers abroad? In compensating those in transfers abroad, an employer has basically three choices. Continue paying based on the person's current home country pay, pay based on what locals in the new country are paid, or pay so the person's home country standard of living stays the same. So this is very, very interesting. So let's say that you work here in the United States and you're getting $150,000. You now move to Switzerland and the cost of living is a lot more, and $150,000 is going to give you a very meager lifestyle. So in order to maintain your same lifestyle here, you need $250,000, okay? So they give you the pay raise. Now, when you move back to the United States and they cut your pay back to $150,000, you're going to feel really, really bad because you're going to feel like you got a pay cut. Okay, so those things are challenging. Now, the other scenario, you're making $150,000 here in the US and you go to South Africa where you could have the same standard of living off of $50,000. Do you get $50,000 over there? That's a huge pay cut. And even though you'd have the same standard of living, if you get paid $50,000 over there, you will feel like you got demoted. So it's really, really challenging to know for employers to figure out how much to pay someone when they go overseas. Same thing when they bring an expat, when they bring, let's say, someone from Switzerland to the US, do they continue to make the $250,000 here? So companies come up with different policies, and then they have to be very, very clear what those policies are going to be when you move between countries. And you may eliminate people from wanting to travel from country to country if they feel that they have to take a pay cut, regardless of standard of living. So sometimes they will pay, let's say, $50,000 while you live in South Africa, but they will give you $25,000 extra that you keep in the United States, that you have as a cushion in the United States, or they give you another benefit. So anyway, so they'll try to do things so that you're not still making the $150,000, and then they'll give you a guarantee that when you come back to the United States, that you will get a pay raise, that you'll go back to $150,000 plus a pay raise. So they put all sorts of binding things in place to ensure that you feel that you are being compensated appropriately. So the steps in establishing a global pay system: you have to set a strategy, identify crucial executive behaviors, set a global philosophy framework, identify the gaps, systematize pay systems, and adapt pay policies. So that's what I was talking about. Because if you pay someone $150,000 in a country where the next manager standing beside you makes $30,000, that pay gap is going to cause problems in the fabric of the organization. So You have to create systems that are going to work inside the organization itself. So firms opening subsidiaries abroad face differing union management relations practices among countries and regions. Managers should steel themselves to more vigorous collective bargaining and negotiations abroad than they may be used to in the US. Employers need to address at least two matters in developing their international safety policies and practices. First is the question of local workers' safety. And the United States has often taken the lead in occupational safety. However, other countries have such laws with which all employers must comply. And in any case, it's hard to make a case for being less safety conscious or fair with workers abroad than you are with those at your home country. The second matter is protecting their own international assignees and international travelers. Legally, employers also have a duty of care for protecting international assignees and their dependents and international business travelers. So many employers use intelligence services for monitoring potential terrorist threats abroad. The head of one intelligence firm estimates such services cost around $10,000 per year. Some employers retain crisis management team services. They then call on these teams, for instance, when criminals kidnap one of their managers. Hiring crisis teams and paying ransoms can be prohibitively expensive for all but the largest firms, and this is a very, very big concern. Given the investment the employer makes in training and sending these high potential people abroad, it makes sense to try to retain them. Too many employers waste their investment they've made in the employees they've sent abroad. Losing the returnee also makes losing the knowledge and experience that they've gained while abroad. So formal repatriation programs are very important. You want steps in repatriation. You want simplest things that value the expatriate's experience and brings them home in a good way, closes the loop, and gives them value when they come back to the home office. Now we're going to take a look at some similarities and differences in employee engagement around the globe. A survey of employee engagement around the globe provides some useful observations. On average, the percent of engaged employees, including highly engaged and moderately engaged, was 70% in Latin America, 65% in North America, 61% in Asia, Pacific, and Africa, Middle East, and 57% in Europe. The percentage of actively disengaged employees was highest in Europe at 19%, lowest in Latin America at 12%, and 15 to 16% in North America, Asia Pacific, Africa, and Middle East. The trend was for employee engagement, highly and moderately engaged in all regions of the world, to be converging around the current global average of about 61% of employee engagement. So workers everywhere are becoming about equally engaged. What are the top drivers of employee engagement around the globe? Career opportunities was the #1 key driver of employee engagement in all regions of the world. So employers who know how to provide job opportunities, career growth opportunities, are the ones that are experiencing the best opportunities. So what about examples of how to implement a global human resource management program? Companies tend to evolve from running their international operations from home-based international units to multinational structures where subsidiaries abroad largely control themselves to fully unified global companies with a unified management structure worldwide. Being global affects how the company organizes and manages its human resource management function. The global firm's emphasis will likely be on standardized HR practices worldwide. First, these employers engage in two best practices in developing their worldwide HR policies and practices. One, form global HR networks. And two, remember that it's more important to standardize ends and competencies than specific measures. So to head off resistance, HR managers around the world should feel part of their firm's global HRM team. Treat the local HR managers as equal partners. And then remember, it's more important to standardize ends and competencies than try to keep methods standardized. So the three best practices, remember that truly global organizations find it easier to install global systems. Investigate pressures to differentiate and determine their legitimacy, and try to work within the context of a strong corporate culture. Finally, two best practices helped ensure success in actually implementing the global consistent human resource policies and practices. One, you can't communicate enough. And two, dedicate adequate resources. And that's the key, guys. That's really the key. I find global human resources to be fascinating. The way today we can move people around the globe, take advantage of the skill sets and the knowledge base from anybody from anywhere in the world and plug them in wherever it's needed is just beautiful. So, and today, employers will create a database of skill sets and hardly even worry about where you live and just plug you in wherever you're needed. And it's just fascinating. So hopefully you get an opportunity to work in a multinational team. And it's interesting because you end up having meetings at whatever time of day or night, depending on what the lead team is, and you adapt to their time zone, regardless of where you live.